So I've been doing some studying, refreshing my memory on fascism, and I was able to finally get to a checklist about how to identify fascism. And it's kind of complicated. Hey everyone, I'm Miguel Lopez. I'm a historian of the Second World War. And the reason fascism is complicated because fascism was nation dependent. Each nation had their tweaks to it. It's almost as you further delve into fascism as a subject, it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect where it just gets more complicated. Some examples of differences for would be fascism in Germany was centered on biological racism and anti-Semitism. Those two things directly drove its domestic and foreign policies. But the fascism in Italy was not driven by anti-Semitism or biological racism. It's very weak in Italy. And even before 1930, those two things were not driving its domestic and foreign policy. And even Mussolini said in 1930 that he criticized biological racism and that for him, race was about feeling. So you see those two differences. Even the fascism movement in Romania, the Iron Guard, it was based on religion, as a religion based as a nation, and it itself criticized biological racism. So, like Ian Kershaw has been quoted, very famous historian about the Third Reich and Hitler. He said, "quote Trying to define fascism is like trying to nail jelly to a wall." So the next inherent question is going to be, how does one define fascism? And scholars will look at past fascist movements and they will look at those movements' words and actions. And depending on the scholar and their theoretical context, they're going to weigh words and actions slightly differently. But that does not mean that there is not an academic consensus. There is an academic consensus, a broad consensus over through the study of these movements of what fascism is in a broad context. You can go look at the Encyclopedia Britannica. It will say the academic consensus is extreme militaristic nationalism, a contempt for liberal democracy, liberal culture, and liberal political ideals, the belief in a national social hierarchy, the rule of the elites. It's going to mention Volksgemeinschaft, which is a German meaning for a people's community, which is going to be for the Nazis racially based. You can also go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Fascism is a far right political philosophy, a theory of government. So the U.S. Holocaust Museum is condensing the consensus a little bit, but there is an academic consensus. The debate for scholars is below the academic consensus of trying to come to a recognized, specific, detailed definition of fascism. Kevin Passmore, in his book for the Oxford University Press, Fascism, a very short introduction, gives a very good synopsis on the difficulties of trying to define fascism from various approaches. In his table, he will show a common list or checklist of 15 items that would define a movement as fascist. The thing with the list is what happens if the movement doesn't fulfill all 15? Maybe it's only 12 or maybe it's only 8. Are they fully fascist or are they fascist like or light? The other way scholars approach trying to define fascism is maybe forming a baseline, like a lowest common denominator. Now, what's going to influence this as well as the checklist, is the theoretical approach, and this comes about of the scholar's background. In this case, is it going to be a Marxist interpretation or a Weberian interpretation based off scholar Max Weber? Is it going to be a totalitarian interpretation, or is it going to be a interpretation of seeing fascism as a political religion? So definitions, because of the etymological fallacy, has its limitations because definitions by their inherent nature create a solid border of you're in or you're out. But as human beings, we don't operate that way. We operate conceptually. So what fascism may mean to one group may not be exactly the same as the other. It's not cookie cutter here. So, where does this leave us in trying to understand fascism? First, fascism is not static. It evolves, and each movement had their variations. Fascism is also inherently contradictory. The anti Semitism in Nazism was contradictory because they would say Jews were subhuman and inferior, yet Jews were the power centers in the United States and in Great Britain and in the Soviet Union, and they were near to destroying Germany. How can you have both at the same time? It's a contradiction. The second part is through the study of these historical movements, academics have come up with an academic consensus of what is fascism. And also taken into account is that conservative power centers in these countries aligned themselves with fascism because they had the same common enemy, very specifically, socialism and communism. The third part is there are various approaches to understanding fascism and trying to get your arms around it. And what I'm going to list now is four different scholars that have four different approaches to try to understand fascism. The first scholar is going to be Roger Griffin. He's the one that comes up with the term fascist minimum. It serves as a lowest common denominator baseline to see if there's an ideal fascism. And for him, all fascist movements have this mythical core, this desire to return to a mythical, nostalgic past. The other scholar I'll bring up is Umberto Eco. He's well known for coming up with 14 properties of fascism. So, this is where you get your list of what a fascist movement will be or should be. Then you have Robert O. Paxton from his book, The Anatomy of Fascism. And he looks at fascism in five different stages of its evolution: creation, taking root, getting power, exercising power, and radicalization or entropy. Now, what I'm going to include in here is that in the taking root and getting power, if you look at the rise of Nazi Germany and fascism in Italy, this is where the conservative power centers and the captains of industry assisted these fascist movements because they both had the common enemy of socialist and communist. The final scholar I'll mention is Roger Eatwell. He views fascism through a matrix of three overlapping cores. His first core is the new man. And within this new man, you often find this focus on hyper masculinity that you find in Italy and in Nazi Germany, and a focus on the warrior class. Both of these have been influenced by the devastation of the First World War. The second core is going to be a holistic nationalism. And for Eatwell, it helps him identify if there is a generic fascism. The third one is going to be the new third way. Many fascist movements saw themselves above the traditional left right political spectrum, hence the third way. And for Eatwell, this means that fascism may have porous borders with socialism and conservatism. So, in closing, I hope this helps everybody understand that fascism is complex and that despite this complexity, that there is a broad academic consensus that I've mentioned before from Britannica and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, that fascism is a far right political movement, a populist movement seeking to return to a mythical, nostalgic past so that the nation can be purified of its ills, of the other, to return this nostalgic past to restore to its prior glory. So hopefully that helps out, and I'll see you next time.